Carraig Dulra is a social enterprise established in 2007 by myself and my husband Mike in County Wicklow, and all its profits are basically reinvested in its social and environmental objectives. Earth Care is Hannah. Do you want to just introduce yourself, Hannah, briefly?
Hi, yeah, I'm Hannah Mole. I'm based in Roscommon and work very closely with Suzie and Mike through Carraig Dulra with education offerings, but also with design consultancy. And yeah, I run a small business, sole trader, running permaculture, mostly education community, anything community, kind of linking into that. And then I do design consultancy solo and in collaboration with other people, Suzie, or maybe an ecologist or whoever else we need to bring on board to the team.
So all of our activities are connected to the community, and they're connected to the other than human world that we are all part of. And I suppose that we've had a particular approach to trying to understand these local and global intersection of all these interdependent issues of justice, poverty, integration, climate change, biodiversity crisis, but they're all underpinned by the ethics of permaculture. And we'll talk a little bit more about what permaculture is and how it connects. But they're linked us, these ethics really linked us to development education, global citizenship education. And it's a little bit like social enterprise at the beginning. When we set up, we weren't using that term. And then somebody said to us, you realize you're a social enterprise. And something similar happened with global citizenship education, where I was connecting with local community education officers in Wicklow ETB at the time, and they said, you're doing development education. So we joined IDEA, and we joined, I was a member of the informal adult education group for a couple of years in IDEA, and we've just kind of gone from there. So just to, we will give you a little bit of a definition of permaculture in a minute, but this is kind of the why behind what permaculture is, and a lot of times people come to it from one of these different overlapping circles. So people come to it from the environment, from soil life, from working with biodiversity and looking at hydrological cycles. But then that obviously starts interacting with the economy, and so looking at what that means in a permaculture regenerative sense is all around the reinvestment or poverty alleviation. And then, of course, in society, I guess what happened with permaculture was that it became a global movement, and it was a network of interconnections without borders. It fosters a lot of ecological literacy, but it also honors diversity, not just in the ecosystem, but in the human systems, and trying to emphasize cooperation over competition. We've just finished a permaculture design certificate over the last several months, and at the end of it we asked our participants for their definition of permaculture, and you'll find that there is a huge variation in definitions, and then we handed them out a whole lot of other definitions sought from around the place. But at its essence, it's the harmonious integration of all life's kingdoms into productive ecosystems and socially just environments, producing sound outcomes through systems care. So it's regenerative design, and its intention is to reflect patterns in nature. It's seeking to build interconnections that allow for functional efficiency and abundance of yield. And so that's what we come along, but you'll see that sometimes it's described as permaculture is a revolution disguised as organic gardening. I'll come back to that in a minute. This is a framework that I've used a great deal when trying to talk about what we mean by generative or regenerative. It was developed by the Climate Justice Alliance. And I suppose sometimes it's easier to describe what is degenerative or extractive in our systems. And so people will, are aware of exploitation and the consumerist and perhaps colonial mindset to some degree. People are aware that resources are extracted, dug up, and then burned and dumped. And then to some extent, obviously, depending on where you are in this system, you're aware of the enclosure of wealth and power. And definitely, I think these days, many people are aware of that the governance is around militarization. So there are many different approaches here. You know, many people are working to stop the bad, to campaign and block. But there's also, I suppose, the need to build the new in the shadow of that. So divest from their power and starve and stop, but also invest in our power. So a lot of the regenerative approach is over here in the living economy, where we're talking about regeneration of our ecosystems, regeneration of our communities, through cooperation, our ecological and social well-being being deeply linked with each other, and our governance being deep democracy, and our worldview not being colonial but caring and sacred, and reawakening the indigenous awareness in all of us. So I guess many people who come to permaculture come to it through environmentalism, but I'm sure some of you will recognize Chico's quote that environmentalism without class struggle is just gardening. And we try to, and very much work with people come to a permaculture course thinking perhaps it's just gardening. And but it is a sort of threshold through which we can unpack and explore all of these other issues. So people might begin by fighting in protection for their space. In the case of Chico, it was the rubber trees and then the Amazon, and then he realized he was fighting for humanity. And I think that our learners sometimes go on a similar journey. But just to talk a little bit about its evolution, permaculture is a worldwide curriculum. The PDC is this Permaculture Design Certificate, but it can be seen as a Western science-based codification of Indigenous worldviews and knowing and ways of knowing. And we always kind of name that because although we will talk about there's origins that, that are known about where in the 1970s in Australia, Bill Mollison, a forest ecologist, and his student began to talk about this kind of systems thinking and regenerative work, but we obviously acknowledge that it didn't start there. It started long before in terms of our understanding of how to live in these different ways. That little model of what we mean when we talk about development is these different, the environmental space, the holistic animal management, this hydrological cycle, the soil food. So what's happening in the water, what's happening in the soil, what's happening in diversity of plants and animals, and how we can regenerate those. The built environment, so integrative and appropriate technology, low impact infrastructure and dwellings development, and then all the social factors that weave through that, the social inclusion, regenerative education. So our not a banking education as Freire would have called it, but how we generate the kind of spillover education throughout the tutor groups and the participants. Natural and cooperative living, which we, as Hannah will talk about maybe a bit more, is we don't talk about that, we do that. We live in a cooperative way with our participants through different parts of the course. And we have a lot of creative human interaction and the ecological design. And then we're in the economic space, we're looking at those conscious and fair share and cyclical pieces. So I'm going to hand over to Hannah because I want to, with these images, show how we deal with all that stuff that I just touched on very briefly. So Hannah, do you want to kind of walk us through this part?
So I'll just give you a flavor of kind of how we do that. We kind of come up against that in practical terms. So our programs vary in length, but the main one that we're talking about here, the PDC, it's the standard kind of a format, and it's certified by the UK Permaculture Association. So it does have a curriculum, like a core curriculum, that we work from. And then, but it's extremely flexible in terms of how you actually deliver, or not even deliver, but I suppose touch on those core curriculum points. But that is still our foundation for the course. And then the way we've developed over the years doing this, we really are changing. Every time we run this program, we change things and we change direction and we emphasize one thing more than another. But our overall approach is a very engaged learning and very, very embedded in the landscapes. We also, this year, we ran a teacher training course for people who have previously done PDC programs, not necessarily with us, and who are interested in getting into teaching permaculture. So we've kind of been drumming into those guys in the last few months, teaching methods, like loads of different teaching methods and teaching styles and learner styles. So we diversity is a permaculture principle, use and value diversity. So we really bring that into the learning environment. And the experience, it's very experiential, as you can see from these photos. We do as much as possible hands-on, getting your hands into the earth, into the plants, connecting with animals in a very tangible way. But that is always quite as much as we want to, only really from a time perspective. We're sort of doing this dance between creating a temporary community and a taste of what it's like to live together in community with whatever rules and agreements we make between ourselves. But we're also bound by like time, because we have a schedule and we have, you know, sort of outcomes from that curriculum that we want to touch on. And then we also have just all kinds of practical constraints. So we're always kind of in this tension between those things, even where we can't do as much hands-on practical, say like skills-based stuff, we would point people to that. You know, you can go here and learn that exact skill. And even without kind of, you know, learning every single practical skill that you might need to lead this kind of a lifestyle, we're still in the landscape. We do loads of site visits and tours. It's very much about demonstration value, seeing these kind of things actually, other people actually doing them and living them. And also we're very, very honest. I think that's kind of probably something a little bit unique about our programs. Like we only work with tutors who are going to be really honest about what's not working for them. We don't do any like hypothetical permaculture. We don't do hypothetical permaculture. We do what's really happening, what are the challenges, what can actually be achieved, but really through demonstration and being on site and getting hands in the soil and with plants. And then we have a huge, really wide tutor team as well. So Suzie, Mike, and I are the core tutors, and we coordinate the course and design it. And we are the kind of the threads throughout the course. We kind of pull out these teams and highlight them, but we bring in people who have direct experience of the different topics, and also who are running projects to actually give life to these ideas and these connections.
Yeah, and I think that as we expose everybody through different site visits, through these hands-on and practical pieces, and through that really wide tutor team that includes people who are other global citizenship educators or soil experts or water in the landscape or local food systems, you know, all of those different pieces that are weaving through the program, it starts to surface for people the questions that then we give an ample amount of space for conversation. We have long lunch times. There's a section of the course where people live together for 5 days, because that's where people start unpacking how come, if this is possible, this abundance of food, or if this regeneration of a landscape, because there's often for a site visit there might be a before and after, and people see, wow, this was a field and now it's this incredibly restored landscape producing food and abundant biodiversity and pond life and so on. Then, you know, why is it not like this? It's sort of, we don't start with the why. The why emerges because people see what's possible. And then we get into, you know, lots of deeper conversations about extractive capitalism and the fragmentation and division in systems and the brittle and fragility of ecosystems. And we make some comparisons. You know, we talk a little bit about all that complexity, but also how, you know, there are global examples of where if a degraded landscape leads to, you know, and it's not done by accident, the kind of extractive militarized degradation leads to the fragmentation and polarization in human society, but also brittleness in the ecosystem. And we kind of make those links all the time, weaving that we are part of the natural world, that we're not separate from it, and that the things that affect it affect us in everything from mental health to polarized politics. So that those are kind of conversations that you can't really see within the written curriculum, and you can't see in the words that we speak about it, but that people basically experience. So that's what Hannah was talking about, that complex venues, field trips, tutors. And then, as I say, it does it's hard to explain what the kinds of transformation that happens for people, but I'm sure people in other global citizenship programs are very aware of transformative education, and how hard that is to measure impact or describe. But I sometimes, summarize it as it's an anti-fragmenting intervention, because permaculture is all about the ecological relationships and the human relationships. So everything we're doing is plugging people into the ecosystems they are living in, the network of past learners, the tutors and their organizations, and this supportive learner group that help them develop their own future learning and action pathways, which we actively try to support. And so this image here on the left, I'm sure it's a game some people that know, but that's what the whole course is basically, trying to work about at those relationships between our species and our environment, how our designs impact people, how they compete for, whether they compete for resources or whether they're collaborative, and all of that kind of growing understanding, and whether that's a community garden or a private farm or an eco community trying to share land, or whether it's built environment, or whether it's a social permaculture intervention, which is something that a term we use a lot. But this is one of the quotes, just as a flavor. The word paradigm shift is probably the most appropriate to describe the whole experience. I went into the course with a very individualistic mindset and goals, adding to stress to myself, thinking, how will I complete all these projects and goals alone? The course made me reflect and realize we don't have to do these things alone, and that power is within the community. I'd expected to pick up a couple of skills that I could apply to my own garden. I walked out of the course to a whole new world and a way of thinking. It was not just the course, it was so much more, and ever since I have felt like I'm still learning every day. So just to finish up, so as we can have time for questions and conversation, where we are now, as Hannah said, we started this developing this course over 11 years ago. We started from the very beginning in making sure that it was as accessible and inclusive as we could. In financial terms, it was always had grant-aided places, gift and exchange places, and then during COVID, we ended up moving into a blended and online space, and making digital resources as well. And that was another layer of inclusion, but also, challenging for some learners. And this year, we really, even though we would have had a diverse representation of learners throughout those 11 years, we really felt that we hadn't managed to access learning. We had once briefly through a collab conversation and collaboration, had one IAP, asylum seeker, but we felt like we needed to build a better support around that if we're going to include more people from living in DP or seeking asylum here. So we added another layer with a dedicated learner support staff, local host accommodation, and transport assistance, and covered travel costs and other things. So this year we had 6 people coming in under that supported learner pathway. And then we continued to expand where the PDC takes place. It started off just at Carraig Dulra on the farm in Wicklow. Hannah then ran a PDC in Roscommon. Then we've reblended them and we've added common knowledge this year. And then we always have lots of other site visits. So it runs starting off, I think, this year in May with an online, then a weekend that includes Hannah's farm and another site visit, then online again, then 2 more days in Roscommon area, the Midlands, then up to Carraig Dulra for 5 days with those online sessions in between, just checking people's, like, doing a session. And this year we were able to have an additional session through a contact permaculture teacher in a refugee camp in Jordan from Palestine. And so we had a live session from him talking about how these permaculture principles and teachings were happening, and what they brought to the refugee camp, that in the work that they've done over a 6-year period, I think. So it's, as Hannah says, we're constantly redesigning. And this is our next challenge, is to continue that process of decentralizing what we're doing, expanding that IAP support, iterating from what we've learned from that and from those learners, more site visits, more real world connections, and that's always what we're building, and continually growing this network. We have 144 graduates in a WhatsApp group. There are more that don't live in WhatsApp land. And we have probably a 20-person tutor team we draw on, and I don't know how many sites at this point, probably 12 or 15. And so this is that little map there is what permaculture design, one of the tools we use is a design web. There are others. And then we're building this, as Hannah mentioned, we've been training new teachers and trying to build that through mentoring and rotating in new teachers. So for us, this is just some of the some of the questions we sometimes ask, that not necessarily for our discussion point, but also for those that are watching online later, just some niches that different people occupy in the world and in a course system. What kind of spaces we create, what are generative spaces in course space and education, what creates spirals that are virtuous cycles or positive social outcomes, and then how those all compare to the opposite of that, fragmenting brittle spaces where spirals of erosion, burnout, not good succession, collapses, and not supports for vulnerable populations. So those are kind of something for people online to think about.